I want to pursue the question of globalization as it played out really since the 1980s. You and I have both been critical of hyperglobalization, insisting on the free flow of capital across borders and insisting on free trade agreements that were part of the neoliberal globalization project. Now, people like us criticize the unfettered, unregulated flow of capital and goods across borders, but we tend to be in favor of more generous immigration policies, which is the flow of people across borders. And those to the right of center tend to be critical of increased levels of immigration, even as they endorse and promote the free flow of capital and goods. Which side is being inconsistent?
Well, actually, your question makes me think of the recent reading of the new edition of your book, Democracy's Discontent, which was first published in 1996. And actually, I wanted to also ask you about that. So I'm going to reverse your question, okay. Which is, in this new edition, you make very clear, as you just said, how, the excess of globalization and the fact that left of the center government, in effect, supported free trade globalization, financialization, and also the rise of meritocratic ideology and other topic I want to ask you about, how this contributed to the sort of to the weakening of democracy that we have today, and the fact that the Republican, in the case of the US, in particular Donald Trump, but more broadly the Republican Party, was able to gradually to portray the Democratic Party as a party, favoring basically the winners of the market, whereas historically the Democratic Party, like Social Democratic Party and Labour Party in Europe, was a party, supporting the working class, the lower middle class, and with very little support from the top of the distribution. Now, this has been reversed. And, I think instead of blaming Trump and blaming the Republicans, which, is always easy to do, of course, I think the Democrats in the US and, comparable parties in Europe will be well advised to look at their shortcomings and something I really enjoyed very much in your in Democracy's Discontent new edition is the way you show that both the Clinton mandate 1992 to 2000 and the Obama mandate 2008 to 2016, so two very long 8-year mandate by Democratic president, are also mandate where in a way, the neoliberal turning point by Reagan in the 80s was legitimated in the sense that both administrations went very far in the direction of globalization, free trade, NAFTA agreement, creation of WTO, China entry in WTO. Now, you're asking me, should we control more trade, capital, labor? I think you have to control something. And I think if you don't control free trade, you don't control capital flows, then indeed the nativist alternative and the sort of nationalist alternative that is promoted by Trump or that has been promoted by Brexiters in UK is, okay, let's control the labor flows. In the end, I think my answer is that we should control a lot more the capital flows and the trade flows, and the labor flow. Of course, you need to have rules about how you pay for education, how you pay for housing, how you pay. All of this needs to be looked at very carefully. We are not just transporting commodities. Where when people come with their family, you need to look at the social condition of integration, and you have to make sure that all the right conditions are met. But at the end, this is a challenge that can be addressed if we control capital flows and trade flows. And I think that's why we should be, very careful to distinguish, the different response to the excess of globalization. You have the sort of nationalist response, nativist, anti-migrant, which we see with Trump, which we see with Le Pen in my own country, etc. But then you have also, like in the US, you had the Sanders response, which I like to call the democratic socialist response. And one question I wanted to ask you about this, when reading your work, is at some point, maybe one point of disagreement which we might have is you use the term populist, to describe these two different responses to the excess of globalization. Now, of course, you make clear that this is not the same kind of populism, but still you use the term populist, which, as far as I am concerned, I would not use, because I think, there's a risk, this can be, to me, this is a rhetoric that's used a lot by people who claim to be in the center, but who tend to be mostly the winners of the market process, and who like to delegitimate all their opponents by saying, all my opponents from the left, from the right, are all populists. They are so using this same term, to me, is a bit risky. But maybe that's a French or European perspective, or maybe it's different in the US. But that's right.
So you would reserve it for right-wing populists?
I will not use it. Actually, I will talk about nationalist ideology, socialist ideology, liberal ideology.
Yeah.
I think socialism, nationalism, liberalism are legitimate ideologies. They all have a point to bring to the democratic table, to the conversation. Yeah. Calling them populist, to me, is generally a strategy to sort of delegitimate some of this group. At least this can be used this way. But I know this is not the way you want to use it, but so many people use it this way.
Right.
As you were mentioning, restricting labor flows is very different from restricting capital flows. And so if all opponents to free market globalization are populists, and we're mixing up very different.
Okay, well, let me try to address that. First, on the use of populism, and this may reflect difference in nuance or usage between Europe and the U.S. But the reason I use it to describe both Trump and Marine Le Pen on the one hand, and a figure like Bernie Sanders on the other, is that, at least in the American political tradition, the origin of the term populist in the 19th century was the coming together of industrial workers and farmers to try to win power from economic elites, typically Northeastern economic elites who controlled railroads and later the oil companies. And it was a progressive movement, though even then it had nativist and anti-Semitic and racist elements. So these two strands, representing the people against the powerful, and this nativist strand, they've been present from the start. But in recent times, it seems to me that the success of right-wing populism, the authoritarian nativist strand, arises as a symptom of the failure of progressive or social democratic politics. And
this we agree on.
And we saw this in the decisive moment in recent times was the financial crisis of 2008, when first a Republican and then a Democratic administration in the transition from George W. Bush to Obama, they both put in place a bailout of Wall Street in response. Obama had the choice of using that moment to restructure the relation of finance to the economy, or to repair it, to build it back up, and he chose the second. I think this was a decisive moment for his presidency because it represented a departure from the civic idealism that he had inspired as a candidate in 2008, not only in the United States, but around the world. This cast a shadow over his presidency, and it generated two currents of protest. On the left, the Occupy movement, and then the candidacy, the surprisingly successful candidacy of Bernie Sanders in 2016 against Hillary Clinton. And on the right, the Tea Party movement, and ultimately the candidacy of Donald Trump. Both of these strands grew from the anger and outrage and sense of injustice at the bailout and the building back up of Wall Street without holding any of them really to account after 2008. So in a way, the progressive mainstream center-left politicians who governed in the aftermath of Reagan and Thatcher, they laid the groundwork, it seems to me, for the right-wing version of populism or Trump, in the case of the United States, that followed. They prepared the way for it and bear responsibility for it. This takes me back to something that we were discussing earlier about the appeal of markets and of the neoliberal faith. When Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher governed, they governed explicitly, arguing that government is the problem and free markets are the solution. But even after, they were succeeded by center-left politicians and political parties. Bill Clinton in the United States, Tony Blair in Britain, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany. They softened the harsh edges of the laissez-faire capitalism of the Reagan-Thatcher years, but they didn't challenge the fundamental premise, the market triumphalist premise, namely that market mechanisms are the primary instruments for defining and achieving the public good. They never challenged that. Mm-hmm. And so we never really had a public debate about where markets serve the public good and where they don't belong. I think the deep appeal of the market faith during this period, and perhaps for a longer stretch of time, is that markets seem to offer a way of sparing us as democratic citizens from engaging in messy, contentious, controversial debates about how to value goods and how to value the various contributions that people make to the economy and to the common good. So it arises, this is my hunch, but tell me whether you think this is, whether you agree or not. The market faith arises from a certain liberal aspiration for neutrality toward substantive conceptions of values in the good life.
Yeah, no,
but that's the deep appeal.
I think I agree a lot with that. I think this is, in the end, this is a fear of democracy. This is a fear of democratic deliberation.
Yes.
And this is a fear of what I sometimes refer to in my book Capital and Ideology as a sort of opening the Pandora's box of redistribution, but also revaluation in effect of what we do, and we don't know where to stop. And we don't know where to stop, but in the end, this is our best chance to get somewhere is to accept this aspiration to self-government, which, as you very well remind us in your writing, is at the origin, not only of some of the deepest aspiration in the US in the 19th century, but more generally of modernity in general. Let me come back just a little bit to this term populist. I want to, because you very rightly said that Clinton, Obama, Blair, Schroeder, were not able to question the sort of new neoliberal Wall Street kind of ideology about globalization, financialization, meritocracy, and I fully agree with that. They were not able to challenge this set of beliefs. But Bernie Sanders and to some extent Elizabeth Warren also in 2020 were able to challenge this by putting forward a platform which I like to call democratic socialism, because it goes even further than Roosevelt in terms of progressive taxation, but it also involves a very substantial component of workers' decision-making power in corporation, with a strong representation of workers in board of companies. It also involves a very substantial decommodification through public university, public health system. To me, this is not the expression of anger, sort of populist. I'm still a bit puzzled of why you want to label this populist, because as you say, I understand the history of the term populist in the US, but as you said, even the early use of the term at the late 19th century, early 20th century, sometimes including a sort of uneasy mixture between progressive theme, nativist theme, which I really don't see in Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. So that's why I'm a little bit
Well, they don't.
The fact of calling them populist, I think is giving in a way too much weight to the way the Clintonian and the Blairist want to distance themselves from this. So
that they use it as a term of abuse. The mainstream.
And in the end, this looks very much like democratic socialism to me, or social democracy for the 21st century, if you want. And it's a more to me it's a more precise way to describe what they stand for than left-wing populists. But
well, here maybe this is a nuance of difference in what it means. The populism is not mainly about redistribution, though it does for Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have an egalitarian meaning. It's mainly about reclaiming power for the people from elites. And this is connected to economic inequality, and they're concerned with economic inequality. But the populist strand, if it can be distinguished from the social democratic or democratic socialist strand, is less about redistribution than it is about reclaiming power, giving voice to the people, representing the people against the powerful, and reining in the power of big corporations in the economy.
But having more power for workers' representative in the board of corporation, which is exactly what reclaiming power is about, and both Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, put on the table of the U.S. Congress, very interesting proposal to extend voting rights for workers' representative, is very much in the social democratic tradition of what Swedish social democrats
I don't think it's
social democrat.
We shouldn't worry too much about this, Thomas. There's an overlap.